Have you ever slipped into a world so carefully controlled, so meticulously arranged, that even the way you breathe feels like part of a performance? Tonight, welcome to Victorian London, a place where beauty was not just a preference, it was a full-time job, a public duty, and a quiet battle fought from the moment a woman opened her eyes. So dim the lights, settle into your favorite spot, and let us drift gently into a society where appearance shaped everything. And perfection was never a choice, it was a requirement. In Victorian London, beauty standards were not simply suggestions whispered by fashion magazines or passing trends. They were a framework for existence, strict rules woven into every hour of the day, every layer of clothing, and every breath drawn under a tightly pulled corset. A woman's value, her reputation, her opportunities, even her future marriage prospects all depended on how successfully she performed the role assigned to her. And the role was demanding. Delicate, pale, graceful, composed, and always perfectly controlled. Imagine waking up in a world where someone might judge your social worth before you even sit up in bed. A world where your hair had to fall just right, where your posture signaled your upbringing, where your skin tone revealed your class, and where your waistline announced your discipline. Victorian beauty standards shaped bodies. Yes, but they also shaped identities. To live as a woman in this era was to live inside a quiet but relentless pressure, an expectation to embody an ideal that was not just uncomfortable, it was nearly impossible. From the earliest hours of the morning, the performance began. Before sunlight reached the windows, a woman was already preparing herself, layering creams, powders, oils, garments, and expressions. Not simply to look beautiful, but to look correct. The ideal Victorian woman was not meant to appear vibrant, energetic, or sun-kissed. Instead, she was expected to embody a kind of refined stillness, pale, fragile, almost ethereal. As though she existed just slightly apart from the real world, untouched by labor, sunlight, or any sign of physical exertion. This was not an age that valued natural beauty as we understand it today. Instead, beauty was a symbol, of visual code that revealed a woman's place in society. Pale skin meant she did not work outdoors. A tiny waist meant she was disciplined, controlled, and willing to endure discomfort to maintain her social position. A calm expression showed her self-restraint. Smooth hands proved she did not do physical labor. Every detail of her appearance carried meaning, and every meaning carried consequences. The expectations extended far beyond clothing or cosmetics. They shaped behavior, posture, movement, and even thought. A Victorian woman was expected to sit a certain way, walk a certain way, smile only lightly, speak softly, and never display too much enthusiasm. Too loud, and she risked seeming undignified. Too confident, and she risked seeming improper. Too much color in her cheeks might suggest she spent time outdoors, or worse, that she was too energetic. The ideal was a woman who appeared calm, delicate, and slightly removed from the everyday world, as though her beauty was both effortless and inevitable. But nothing about it was effortless. Behind every natural look lay hours of effort. Even the simplest morning routine involved countless small tasks designed to protect the illusion of ease. Powders were applied carefully to hide redness. Cold water was splashed on the face not for refreshment, but to restrain any sign of vitality. Hair was brushed, oiled, pinned, rearranged, and inspected. Clothing was layered and adjusted. Expressions were practiced in the mirror. All of this before breakfast. And the pressure did not ease outdoors. In the streets of London, a woman walked through a world of eyes. Some judging. Some comparing. Some admiring. Some evaluating her suitability as a wife or mother. A woman who appeared too energetic risked criticism. A woman who smiled too warmly risked gossip. A woman who looked flushed risked being labeled as someone who did not understand elegance. Every moment in public was a continuation of the performance, as important as any ball or dinner. Even private spaces provided little relief. Homes were full of family members, servants, and visitors, each one capable of noticing something out of place. A loose curl. A faint stain. An untied ribbon. A nose slightly pink from cold. Any of these could become subjects of conversation. Small notes that slipped their way into social circles. News traveled fast, even when it was trivial. A woman's appearance was not just her responsibility, it was her reputation, her family's reputation, and her future. To understand Victorian beauty standards is to understand a world built on layers of clothing, layers of meaning, layers of judgment, layers of pressure. Women were expected to rise to these standards every single day, even when tired, unwell, or overwhelmed. And behind the lace, the powders, and the polished appearances were countless private moments of discomfort. Ribs pressed by corsets. Skin irritated by harsh creams. Hair pulled tight into complicated shapes. Feet squeezed into narrow shoes. Muscles aching from holding the correct posture hour after hour. Beauty was a discipline, a practice, and a quiet endurance. Yet within this immense pressure, there was also something strangely human, something that reveals how people adapt, cooperate, and survive under strict expectations. Women shared tips in whispers, borrowed tricks from friends, practiced new ways of tying ribbons or arranging curls. They supported each other through embarrassing mishaps, exchanged advice about remedies, and laughed quietly about the impractical trends of the season. Beneath the strict surface, there was a network of subtle solidarity. And despite the rigidity of their world, Victorian women found ways to express themselves within the rules, choosing fabrics they loved, perfumes that comforted them, small touches that brought a sense of personality to an otherwise strict uniform. Beauty, even in its most constrained form, allowed moments of identity, creativity, and even rebellion. Tonight, as we explore this world together, remember that Victorian beauty was not about vanity. It was not a frivolous pursuit. It was a language, a shield, a requirement for survival, and a lifelong performance shaped by society's expectations. It was difficult, exhausting, and often unfair, but it was also a complex cultural system that reveals the heart of Victorian values: order, control, propriety, and the belief that appearances reflect virtue. So as you settle into the quiet of this night, imagine walking through those gas-lit streets, glancing into shop windows filled with lace and ribbons, hearing the distant clatter of carriage wheels on cobblestones. Imagine living in a world where every detail mattered. Where every morning began with a preparation not just for the day, but for the judgment of others. And where every evening ended with the quiet relief of finally removing the layers that held everything in place. This is Victorian London, elegant, demanding, beautiful, and heavy. A world where perfection was expected, comfort was rare, and the simple act of existing required strength, patience, and endless discipline. And tonight, we are stepping gently into that world, not with pressure or expectation, but with curiosity, calm, and the soothing understanding that the past is a place we can visit, observe, and learn from, without ever having to live it ourselves. Morning in Victorian London did not begin with sunlight or birdsong. It began with pressure, quiet, persistent, and deeply woven into every waking moment of a woman's life. Before a single foot touched the floor, she was already being measured against the invisible standards of propriety, elegance, and self-control. And though no one else might be in the room with her, the awareness of being judged lingered like a shadow at the edge of her thoughts. Imagine opening your eyes in a room so cold you can see your breath. The fire has long gone out, leaving only a few fading embers glowing like tired stars across the grate. Heavy blankets weigh down your body, layered not for comfort, but for sheer survival against the London chill. Above you, a silk nightcap sits crooked on your head, a small, comical betrayal against your attempts to keep your hair neat overnight. Already, the morning is flawed. Already, you imagine the raised eyebrows your mother or sister might offer if they saw you like this. Before even sitting up, you feel the familiar flutter of morning anxiety. Will your hair have stayed smooth? Will your face carry that unfortunate early redness? Will your breath smell faintly of the charcoal powder used the night before? These small details mattered, not because anyone would see them immediately, but because the first person you confronted each morning was not your maid or your mother, it was yourself. And Victorian society demanded that even this private moment be approached with discipline. Slowly, you push your heavy covers aside and sit upright, careful not to disturb the elaborate arrangement of curls meant to survive the night. The room is dim, lit only by the thin winter light sneaking past the heavy curtains. Everything around you feels still, expectant. A row of bonnets is neatly laid out on the nearby dresser, one for breakfast, one for casual company, one for small errands, and one for any unexpected display of sadness, because even sorrow had its own uniform. The first task of the day is simple in theory: make yourself presentable. In practice, it is a battle fought with cold water, stiff fingers, and the constant fear of being caught during the wrong moment. The worst thing that could happen to a Victorian woman was not waking up with wild hair or a crease across her cheek, it was someone else seeing her before she had corrected it. Stepping toward the washstand, you try to move quietly. A maid might enter at any moment, and although she sees everything, the embarrassment of being caught unprepared never fades. You reach for a porcelain basin filled with water that is always colder than you expect. Victorian beauty guides insisted that cold water was invigorating, essential for tightening the skin and calming any unwelcome flush, but you suspect it was another test of resolve. Splashing your face in icy water feels less like self-care and more like a challenge, one that leaves you gasping softly as you grab the edge of the stand for balance. Next comes the inspection. The small oval mirror shows every flaw with sharp honesty. A faint crease from the nightcap. A slight red patch on the cheek. A curl that has attempted escape. Each of these will need to be corrected before anyone else sees you. Victorian life did not allow for the luxury of just woke-up authenticity. Beauty, even the kind that pretended to be natural, had to be constructed carefully. You open a small box of powder, the kind considered safe by the standards of the time, though still made of chalk and other unknown ingredients. With a soft puff, you pat it gently across your skin, careful to cover any hint of redness. Too much, and you risk looking theatrical. Too little, and you look robust, a subtle insult implying you spent too much time outdoors or performed too much household labor. Everything is about balance. Appear refined, but not artificial. Appear fragile, but not sickly. Appear natural, but never unprepared. A Victorian morning was not a simple routine, it was a negotiation between personal comfort and public expectation, one that played out quietly in almost every household. Then comes the hair. Victorian hairstyles prioritized volume, shine, and a kind of soft elegance that rarely matched what anyone naturally woke up with. You gently lift the nightcap away, trying not to panic as your curls fall into an arrangement that could generously be described as defeated. Victorian humidity, smoky air, and heavy bedding were not friends to morning hair. Still, you go to work, brushing with slow, careful strokes that tug at tiny knots formed during the night. You smooth oil into your hair, maybe castor oil, maybe a homemade blend passed down through the women in your family, and you attempt to coax your curls into a shape that communicates composure. A strand perfectly positioned could mean well rested. A strand slightly out of place might suggest you tossed and turned, troubled by thoughts you should have kept to yourself. Just as you secure the last pin, there is a soft knock. The maid. She steps in quietly, carrying the responsibilities of the day on her shoulders, tending the fire, arranging your garments, preparing the room. She has seen it all before. Of course. She knows how long it takes for you to get ready, how you fuss over one curl, how you sigh at the cold water. But even with her familiarity, you feel that instinctive desire to appear composed, even here, even now. Because in Victorian London, the performance did not pause for privacy. Your morning expression, too, had to be practiced. Too cheerful, and you seemed frivolous. Too serious, and you invited unwanted concern. The aim was serene indifference, a polite, gentle neutrality that made you appear calm, thoughtful, and above all, socially appropriate. After washing, smoothing, patting, brushing, curling, and adjusting, you finally step back from the mirror. You look composed, though your fingers ache a little from the cold water and your scalp tingles from the brushing. You are ready at least enough to leave your room without risking whispers. And so the next phase begins. Dressing. Your maid assists with the early layers: the chemise, the drawers, the corset. A corset in the morning feels like a sudden reminder that comfort is a privilege you are not meant to have. As the laces are pulled, your breath shortens, not painfully, but noticeably. You stand straighter. You feel taller. You also feel a little further from yourself, as though the corset has gently pressed your body into a shape the world prefers. Breakfast will come soon. But not before you put on at least 2 or 3 layers of petticoats. Even the act of dressing reminds you that everything you wear signals something: your class, your mood, your intentions for the day. A slightly heavier skirt means propriety. A lighter color suggests optimism. A missing ribbon implies carelessness. Before stepping out of your room, you glance once more at your reflection. You adjust your bonnet. You check your sleeves. You inhale as deeply as your corset allows and let it out slowly, settling into the role you have practiced every day of your life. Only now, after all these quiet battles against cold water, stubborn curls, social expectation, and your own tiredness, are you considered ready. And the day has barely begun. For a Victorian woman, morning was not a gentle transition from sleep to wakefulness. It was the first stage of a long performance, a careful construction of appearance and demeanor designed to meet the world's expectations. It required patience, discipline, and a kind of quiet courage: the courage to present yourself gracefully even when the weight of the day already pressed heavily on your ribs. That was the Victorian morning: cold, quiet, demanding. But always, always perfectly composed. If you want to understand the Victorian world, truly understand it, in all its elegance and pressure, you have to begin with the corset. More than any dress, bonnet, or hairstyle, the corset defined what it meant to be a respectable woman. It carved the body into the fashionable silhouette of the era, but it also carved expectations into the mind. It whispered constant reminders of discipline, self-control, and the importance of appearances. For Victorians, the corset was not an accessory. It was an anchor: the first major garment a woman put on in the morning and the last she removed at night. And from the moment it was laced around her torso, it shaped not just her waist but her entire day. Imagine standing in your bedroom, arms gently lifted as your maid begins tightening the laces behind you. You feel the first tug, a mild pressure, almost comforting, reminding you of the structure beneath your clothing. Then another tug, firmer now. The fabric draws in closer. Your ribs compress slightly. Your breath shortens just a touch. By the third tug, you begin to feel your body shift, encouraged into the slim, upright shape that Victorian society admired so intensely. A Victorian corset was not always as dangerously tight as modern myths suggest, but make no mistake, it changed the body. It lifted the chest, narrowed the waist, supported the spine, and corrected posture so thoroughly that standing without it felt strange. Some women even said they felt unfinished or loose without one. As though the corset had become a kind of external skeleton, a source of both stability and confinement. And that is the paradox: the corset was both helpful and restrictive. Supportive and suffocating. Empowering in one way, oppressive in another. It offered back support to women who spent hours schooling their posture. It shaped dresses beautifully. It created the fashionable hourglass look that magazines praised. But at the same time, it reminded a woman every minute that comfort was not hers to claim easily. The act of tightening the corset itself could be emotional. Some mornings, a woman requested a gentler lacing on days when she felt faint or overwhelmed. Other mornings, especially before major social events, she asked for a much tighter fit. The maid knew the rhythm of these requests, reading mood from posture, from the slight tremble in the shoulders, from the way a woman inhaled before the final pull. When the laces were tied securely and tucked in, the transformation was immediate. A woman stood straighter, shoulders pulled back, waist defined sharply. She looked elegant, composed, sculpted into the ideal silhouette. And yet, beneath all that beauty, the corset changed everything she did next. Every breath became a measured breath, shallow, controlled, precise. Every movement became a guided movement, graceful, deliberate, limited. Every meal had to be small enough to prevent discomfort. Every bend, twist, or step required calculation. Walking down the stairs became a slow glide. Sitting required a careful, practiced descent, keeping the spine straight and the shoulders relaxed even when the ribs protested. Turning to look behind oneself became an art of gently shifting the entire torso, not just the neck. The corset dictated how a woman existed in space, shaping not just her silhouette but her presence. To modern eyes, this might seem unbearable. But for Victorian women, it was simply a part of life, like brushing one's teeth or tying one's shoes today. They did not question why they wore a corset. They questioned what their waist measurement said about them. A tightly laced waist was not merely a shape. It was a statement. It signaled discipline. It signaled refinement. It signaled that a woman belonged to the realm of gentility, not labor. It signaled that she prioritized beauty and propriety, as society expected. Even the very sound of the stays tightening, that soft creak of fabric and the faint whisper of pulled laces, held a symbolic meaning. It marked the beginning of the day, the moment a woman's private self transitioned into her public form. But beyond symbolism, the corset created physical sensations that followed a woman everywhere. A constant pressure around the torso. A slight lift beneath the bust. A gentle resistance whenever she inhaled deeply. Some women described it as a secure embrace. Others described it as a polite trap. Imagine trying to laugh freely with a corset on. What would normally be a full-bodied sound becomes a softer version, a restrained flutter of amusement. Imagine trying to run, nearly impossible without discomfort. Even walking briskly caused the corset to remind you of its presence. It forced women into slowness, elegance, and composure not because they chose it, but because their clothing demanded it. And yet, for all its restrictions, many Victorian women loved their corsets. Or at least, they believed they did. Society trained them from childhood to feel proud of a tiny waist, to admire women who could endure tight lacing, to view discomfort as a badge of dignity. Girls grew up watching their mothers being laced every morning, hearing the soft pulls and quiet grunts of breath. The ritual became almost sacred. In wealthier households, little girls wore training stays to prepare their bodies for adult corsets. The process began slowly, encouraging posture and teaching patience. By adolescence, the corset had already become a familiar companion, shaping the body long before womanhood arrived. For some women, especially those who attended balls or formal events, corsets became even more important. The tighter the waist, the more dramatic the dress looked. Gowns in the Victorian era were built around the corset designed to accentuate the hourglass shape, with wide skirts and fitted bodices that emphasized every curve and line fashioned by the stays. Standing in a ballroom, surrounded by candlelight and soft music, a tightly laced corset transformed a woman into the image society idealized: elegant, delicate, poised. She seemed as though she might float rather than walk. Observers admired her composure, never fully realizing the physical endurance behind it. But the corset held deeper meanings, two meanings that extended into identity and social relationships. A well-fitted corset suggested a woman was trained, well-raised, and capable of handling the responsibilities of marriage and motherhood. A poorly fitted or absent corset hinted at carelessness or lower social class. The absence of a corset signaled, intentionally or not, a rejection of societal norms. The corset was also a quiet dividing line between the classes. Working-class women wore simpler stays for support rather than beauty, constructed for physical labor rather than fashion. Wealthy women wore delicate silk or whalebone corsets, designed not for practicality but for aesthetics. Each corset told a story about the wearer's life, status, and role. And yet, beneath all the symbolism, the corset was still a real object with real consequences. It pressed on the stomach during meals. It restricted lung expansion during brisk walks. It required regular adjustment and occasional repairs. It caused aching ribs, tender skin, and sometimes bruises. But Victorian women rarely complained openly. Complaints were considered unfeminine, a sign of weakness, or worse, a lack of refinement. The corset also carried a peculiar emotional effect. It created a sort of duality within a woman. Inside, she might feel tired, hungry, anxious, or overwhelmed. But outside, the corset presented a calm, controlled version of her aversion society accepted. The garment became a mask, sculpting both body and expression. Only at night, when the day ended and the world quieted, did a woman finally loosen the laces. The moment the pressure released, she could breathe fully for the first time in hours. She might rub the tender spots along her ribs, stretch her back slowly, or inhale deeply just to feel the air fill her lungs completely. This release was a private luxury, a reminder that beneath the beautiful silhouette lived a real human body, craving rest and softness. The corset shaped the Victorian era more than any invention or trend. It defined how women moved, how they felt, how they were judged, and how they saw themselves. It was not just clothing, it was a philosophy stitched into fabric. A vision of womanhood compressed into inches of tightly drawn lacing. To understand Victorian women, you must understand the corset not as a villain, not as a relic, but as a symbol of a world where beauty and restriction lived side by side, woven together as tightly as the stays pulled every morning. If the corset shaped the Victorian silhouette, then pale skin shaped the Victorian soul. For women of the era, complexion was not just a matter of beauty, it was a statement of status, morality, and even character. A single hint of warmth in the cheeks, one small freckle, or a trace of sun exposure could invite whispers, assumptions, and unkind stories. Pale skin was a language, one that everyone in Victorian London instinctively understood. Imagine standing before your mirror in the dim morning light, your fingers brushing the soft powder resting in its delicate box. You know what society expects of you: skin so light it appears untouched by hardship, by sunlight, by ordinary life. Skin smooth as porcelain, cool as marble, and almost otherworldly in its stillness. This was not about looking youthful or radiant, it was about appearing removed from the physical world entirely, as though you floated above the daily struggles that marked the lives of those who worked outdoors. Victorian London itself made this pursuit even more difficult. The city's air was thick with coal smoke, fog, soot, and dust. A simple walk down the street left a faint gray film on the face. Sunlight was unpredictable, breaking suddenly through clouds and gas-filled haze. Wind carried grit from carriage wheels and horse hooves. The environment was harsh, and yet society expected women to look as though they lived far away from it, somewhere untouched by the city's grime. That contradiction defined much of Victorian womanhood, being expected to appear unaffected by a world that never paused. 2. Keep their complexion pale. Women developed rituals that bordered on the extreme. Cold water splashes at dawn were not just refreshing. They calmed redness. Vinegar rinses tightened the skin. Milk washes softened it. Rosewater, lavender water, elderflower extract each offered a different promise of clarity and neutrality. Even the act of applying these treatments came with an air of quiet seriousness, a kind of meditative precision. But the most popular tools were powders, fine, chalky mixtures that dulled any shine, erased any hint of warmth, and left the skin unnervingly matte. These powders were not always safe. Some contained ingredients modern readers would find startling: lead, arsenic, bismuth. Yet Victorian women trusted them, because the alternative, appearing flushed or sun-kissed, was socially costly. A flushed face hinted that you walked too fast. A tan hinted that you labored outdoors. Freckles hinted that you spent time in sunlight without proper protection. And any of those hints became invitations for assumptions. So women avoided the sun with almost religious devotion. Parasols were not simply accessories, they were portable shields. Gloves covered hands, protecting them from even brief moments of exposure. Veils softened the brightness of daylight. Bonnets framed the face in protective shade. Even short trips outdoors required preparation. Hatpins secured the bonnet, lace gloves were smoothed carefully over the fingers, and the parasol was opened with practiced grace. Walking through London became an exercise in navigation, moving from shade to shade, avoiding bright patches of sunlight, and keeping the face angled just enough to escape direct rays. It was not fear of burning. It was fear of judgment. Even indoors, complexion remained a focal point. Drawing rooms were lit softly to prevent highlighting imperfections. Powder was reapplied before receiving guests. And at social events, women learned to manage their expressions carefully. Smiling too brightly might bring unwanted color to the cheeks, while laughing too freely risked flushing the neck and ears. Victorian society prized stillness, and pale skin was the perfect canvas for stillness. But there was a deeper layer beneath all this. Pale skin symbolized a life free from labor, a life associated with wealth, education, and refinement. In a society sharply divided by class, complexion became an immediate visual marker. A pale face said, "I do not work with my hands." It said, "I am sheltered, protected, elevated." For women who had little control over their futures, complexion became one of the few tools they could use to shape how others perceived them. Yet this pressure placed enormous weight on everyday routines. Even something as natural as warmth in the cheeks during winter could be misinterpreted. Victorian beauty manuals recommended remedies like pressing a cool cloth to the face before entering a room, breathing slowly to keep circulation calm, or pinching the nose gently to prevent redness at the tip. Women became careful managers of their own physiology, aware that their skin told stories they never intended to share. In private moments, many likely felt frustrated, wanting simply to bask for a moment in sunlight. To step outside without layers of protection, to feel warm without worrying what warmth meant. But choices were limited. Beauty was social currency, and complexion was the coin. At night, the skin required its own rituals. Cold creams, thick and fragrant, were massaged gently to remove the day's powder. Some women layered on almond oil or lanolin to repair dryness. Others used homemade pastes of oatmeal or honey to soothe irritation. Despite the natural ingredients, the work was still meticulous, precise, careful. A single lazy evening risked waking up with redness or blemishes, small things, but heavily symbolic. The pursuit of paleness also influenced diet. Delicate foods were praised: light broths, soft breads, fresh fruits, herbal teas. Spicy or rich foods, which might warm the face or stimulate circulation, were often avoided. Even emotional expression was moderated. Intense feelings could create unwanted color in the cheeks. Calmness was ideal. Not only for behavior, but for complexion. What makes this era so fascinating is how much meaning Victorians assigned to something as simple as skin tone. To them, complexion was not just a physical trait, it was a moral one. Pallor symbolized purity, modesty, self-discipline, and the avoidance of worldly indulgence. It suggested a quiet inner life, untainted by passion or exposure. It even shaped stories in literature and paintings. Heroines were pale. Angels were pale. Delicate beauties who captured the admiration of artists and poets were framed with skin as white as fresh linen. Of course, the reality behind that image was much more complicated. Maintaining such skin required constant work. The very city women lived in made that work harder. Coal smoke settled on everything: curtains, hair, skin. The river polluted the air. Carriage wheels churned mud into the streets, sending dust into people's faces. Yet women were expected to stay pristine, untouched by the world they walked through daily. This gap between expectation and reality created a quiet strain. It must have been exhausting to wake each morning knowing your own skin was a daily challenge, a canvas that had to be carefully prepared before you were considered presentable. And yet, Victorian women persevered. They adapted. They shared homemade recipes. They traded tiny boxes of powder. They warned each other about unreliable concoctions sold by traveling vendors. They complemented one another's complexions in gentle, coded ways. Behind the rigid beauty rules, there was community, small, supportive, and often unspoken. In those private moments, perhaps while applying a cool lotion or brushing stray powder from the dresser, women could look at themselves honestly. For a brief moment, the expectations fell quiet. In the solitude of their rooms, they were not symbols of purity or status. They were simply people, tired, determined, navigating a world that valued them most when they appeared flawless. Pale skin may have been the Victorian ideal, but the women behind that ideal were warm, real, human, and far more complex than any beauty standard allowed them to appear. If Victorian beauty had a secret kingdom, it lived in the hair. Long before dresses were fitted or corsets tightened, a woman's hair silently announced who she was: her discipline, her social class, her upbringing, and her grace. In an age before modern shampoos, hairdryers, or conditioners, maintaining beautiful hair was not a simple routine. It was an entire world of effort hidden behind elegant curls and polished buns. Imagine standing in front of your vanity in the early morning, a soft brush in hand. Victorian manuals recommended 100 strokes per day, not for volume or shine alone, but because brushing was believed to reflect a woman's character, patience, gentleness, consistency. Each stroke mattered. Each tug of the brush was part of a daily ritual that began long before breakfast and continued until the stars appeared again. Victorian hair was expected to be long, thick, and glossy, falling in carefully formed waves that framed the face in softness. Even women with naturally straight or fine hair worked tirelessly to shape it into the fashionable styles of the moment: curls that cascaded over the shoulders, elaborate updos, braided crowns, and smooth, polished chignons. But behind every style was work, hours of it, often uncomfortable, sometimes painful. To achieve that glossy sheen, women used oils: castor oil, almond oil, rosemary oil, or homemade blends passed down through generations. These oils had strong scents that lingered in rooms and on pillows. A kind of aromatic signature that marked every Victorian household. A few drops were warmed between the palms before being massaged slowly into the scalp, encouraging circulation, taming stray strands, and keeping the hair pliable enough to shape. But oil came with its own complications. Too much, and the hair looked heavy. Too little, and it frizzed under London's unpredictable weather. Yet women had to manage this balance every day, adjusting for humidity, social events, or even the emotional weight of a moment. On days of stress or sadness, hair often misbehaved and women responded with even more brushing, smoothing, and careful coaxing. Curling was another world entirely. Before the invention of safe curling irons, Victorian women relied on heated tongs, metal rods warmed over candles or stoves. The risk was constant. One wrong move and the hair could scorch, leaving the room filled with the unmistakable, alarming smell of burning. Some women singed sections of their hair so often that small, brittle strands peeked out awkwardly from otherwise perfect arrangements. These mishaps were rarely spoken of, but everyone knew they happened. Many women slept in rag curl strips of fabric wrapped tightly around damp hair. The process was slow and uncomfortable, but it was one of the few ways to achieve soft curls by morning without risking burns. Sleeping with rag curls meant enduring a night of tugging, tightness, and minor headaches. But women did it willingly, because a well-curled morning hairstyle was a hallmark of refinement. And then there were the hairpieces, a quiet secret of Victorian beauty. Many women, even young ones, used them. They added volume, length, or shape to hairstyles, especially when social events demanded dramatic looks. Some were made from human hair, carefully cleaned and curled. Others were made from wool or horsehair, hidden skillfully beneath layers of real curls. Wearing these pieces added weight, literal weight, to a woman's head, making evening events especially tiring. But no one complained openly. Beauty required endurance. Even arranging the hair into an updo was a task that could take an hour or more. Victorian hairstyles were architectural. They involved loops, plaits, twists, and rolls secured with dozens of pins. Not modern, sleek pins, but long metal ones that sometimes scratched the scalp or tugged uncomfortably with sudden movements. Some women became so accustomed to the feeling of pins that they barely noticed them until bedtime, when removing each one felt like peeling away the stress of the entire day. Hairstyles also had strict social rules. Loose hair signified intimacy, and vulnerability appropriate only in private or among close family. Hair tightly pinned indicated propriety. Hair parted in the center hinted at modesty and softness. Hairstyles worn to church differed from those worn at balls. Mourning even had its own guidelines: subdued arrangements, darker ribbons, minimal ornamentation. Young girls wore simpler braids and ribbons, signaling innocence. Married women were expected to elevate their hairstyles with more complexity, suggesting maturity and responsibility. Every curl, every twist had meaning. But perhaps the most exhausting part of Victorian haircare was not the styling itself. It was the constant vigilance. A sudden breeze could dislodge a curl. A humid afternoon could flatten carefully arranged waves. The heat from gas lamps could warm hairpieces uncomfortably. A long carriage ride could loosen pins. Even leaning back in a chair was risky: it could crush the hairstyle's shape. Women learned to sit forward slightly, never fully resting their heads. They learned to turn their necks as a whole instead of pivoting suddenly. They learned to check their hair in reflective surfaces when walking past shop windows. Maintaining hair was not just a morning routine, it was an all-day responsibility. But beneath all the effort, there was something deeply human. Haircare was not only about beauty or social expectations. It was also one of the rare moments when Victorian women could be gentle with themselves. Brushing could be soothing. Oiling the hair offered a moment of quiet. Arranging curls allowed for creativity within limitations. Mothers braided their daughters' hair tenderly. Sisters learned pinning techniques together. Friends shared recipes for oils and rinses. In the middle of a society obsessed with propriety, haircare created pockets of intimacy. Still, the pressure was real. Hair had to be perfect not only for one's own household but for all eyes outside it. A single frizzy strand could trigger unspoken critique. A limp curl could suggest emotional turmoil. A messy bun could imply poor upbringing. Women were expected to keep their hair as composed as their expressions, a symbol of their inner harmony. Night was both a relief and a new beginning. Removing pins felt like freeing the mind. Wiping away the oil from the temple soothed tension. But women could not simply fall asleep. They had to wrap their hair carefully in nets or cloth to preserve it. Even rest was structured. And yet, despite all the hardship, Victorian hairstyles remain iconic not because they were easy, but because they were meaningful. They carry whispers of patience, discipline, creativity, and quiet resilience. Behind every polished curl was a person navigating a world of expectations, trying to present her best self even on days when she felt far from perfect. Victorian hair was beautiful. Yes, but it was also a testament to endurance. Each curl carried a story. Each pin held a moment. Each morning brought new battles between the woman and the world she lived in. And somehow, through effort and persistence, she found ways to shine. If Victorian hair was a quiet battlefield, then makeup was a forbidden language, whispered, hidden, and never acknowledged out loud. To understand Victorian beauty, you must understand this strange contradiction: women did wear makeup, but they had to pretend they were not wearing any at all. It was acceptable to appear beautiful, but unacceptable to appear as though you had pursued beauty. Imagine living in a world where a slightly rosy lip could charm an entire room, but owning rouge could tarnish your reputation. A world where pale, even skin was admired, but admitting to using powder was considered scandalous. Victorian society walked a tightrope between admiration and suspicion. Women were expected to look flawless, but any visible evidence of trying too hard suggested vanity, a trait considered unbecoming, even dangerous. In Victorian London, makeup existed between secrecy and expectation. Early each morning, often before servants entered the room, a woman approached her small box of cosmetics with the care of someone handling contraband. Inside were the essentials: a pot of rouge, a jar of powder, perhaps a small tin of tinted salve for the lips. These items were often hidden in plain sight, disguised as skin care, or tucked behind perfume bottles. To someone glancing quickly, they were harmless. To someone trained in society's rules, they were quietly defiant. Victorian beauty guides told women that the ideal complexion came from inner purity and natural modesty, not cosmetics. But real life was less romantic. Coal-filled London air left cheeks grey, lips pale, and skin dull. So women compensated privately, cautiously, and always with the intent of appearing as though nothing had been applied at all. The goal of Victorian makeup was simple: enhance without revealing. Beautify without confessing. A woman delicately dabbed a tiny amount of rouge onto the apples of her cheeks, just enough to mimic healthy delicacy, not enough to look obvious. She then blended it with a fingertip or a small scrap of cloth until the color softened into something that looked like an emotional whisper rather than a cosmetic choice. Lips received a similar treatment. True lipsticks did not exist yet. Instead, women used salves tinted with berries, beetroot, carmine, or plant extracts. The idea was not to create a bold lip. Boldness was frowned upon, but to add a slight warmth that gave life to the face. A good application made the lips appear naturally tinted, as though touched by winter air. Then came the powder. This step was the most important and the most dangerous. Powder evened the complexion, softened shine, and erased redness. It also signaled refinement. But if applied too heavily, it hinted at deception, and Victorian society was unforgiving of women who appeared to hide too much. With soft, careful taps, a woman dusted powder across her cheeks, forehead, and nose, trying to create the illusion of untouched skin. Some powders were made with chalk. Others with rice flour. The more expensive ones contained finely ground zinc or pearl. A few contained lead, though many women did not know the risks. But the risk was not only physical, it was social. If a woman entered a room wearing too much powder, someone might whisper, "She paints her face." And that phrase, only 4 small words, could injure her reputation. Painting one's face was associated with actresses, dancers, and women of questionable respectability. Respectable women, society claimed, had no need for makeup. Their beauty came from decorum, quiet living, and inner virtue. It did not matter that this was not true. The illusion had to be maintained. Even the act of applying makeup was surrounded by caution. Many women did it behind drawn curtains, or early in the morning before servants arrived. Some had special mirrored boxes that could be closed quickly if someone unexpectedly entered the room. Young girls learned from their mothers not only how to apply cosmetics, but how to keep them hidden. Even husbands were not always allowed to see the process. A married woman was encouraged to appear effortlessly attractive, as though she woke up naturally glowing. Perhaps he suspected the truth, but the performance mattered more than the reality. Makeup was for private hands, not public eyes. When leaving the house, a Victorian woman carried no compact, no mirror, and no cosmetics. Reapplication was unheard of. Instead, she relied on long-lasting preparations, or small tricks, biting the lips softly to restore color before stepping indoors, pinching the cheeks lightly before a social appearance, or turning away from cold breezes that might redden the nose. Subtlety was everything. Victorian London, with its dim gas lighting, favored softness. Harsh lines or bold tones looked unnatural in the warm glow of indoor lamps. So makeup evolved to suit the environment. Instead of strong contours or dramatic colors, the era embraced gentleness, a little brightness here, a little softness there, a complexion touched lightly by life but never overwhelmed by it. Women of higher classes preferred the most delicate touches, barely visible enhancements that signaled health and refinement. Working-class women, when they could afford cosmetics, sometimes used slightly more noticeable applications, but even then, subtlety was admired. Makeup also carried emotional meaning. On days when a woman felt tired or unwell, a tiny bit of rouge helped her look composed. On days when she felt hopeful or inspired, she might apply a bit more warmth to the lips. Cosmetics became a private language of mood and self-expression, a gentle rebellion hidden behind powder and salve. But the secrecy weighed heavily. Imagine living in a world where even small acts of self-care had to be disguised. Where a bit of color could be misinterpreted. Where beauty was demanded but not allowed to be openly pursued. And yet, despite all the restrictions, women found small joys in the ritual. There was something soothing about dipping a fingertip into soft rouge, something comforting in the warm scent of a tinted balm. Something empowering in the ability to create the appearance society expected, even when one did not naturally wake with that look. These daily transformations belonged to women quietly, privately, intimately. They offered a moment of control in a world that controlled nearly everything else. Makeup may have been invisible to Victorian society's eye, but it was deeply present in the lives of Victorian women. And perhaps that is the most beautiful contradiction of all. In an era obsessed with purity and naturalness, cosmetics allowed women to craft their own versions of natural, hidden, delicate, and entirely their own. If makeup in Victorian London lived in the shadows, eyebrows lived in an even deeper kind of secrecy, one woven from modesty, discomfort, and a strange cultural insistence that brows should be present, but only barely. To understand eyebrows in this era is to understand a beauty standard built on contradiction. Eyebrows were meant to exist, but not enough to draw notice. They had to be shaped, but never manicured. And heaven forbid anyone caught you darkening them. Imagine starting your morning in a room lit only by the soft glow of a cloudy London sky. You sit before a small vanity mirror, slightly warped, slightly dusty, and brace yourself for one of the day's most delicate ordeals, shaping your eyebrows. This is not a glamorous moment. No fluffy beauty brushes. No sleek tweezers. No soothing balm. Victorian eyebrow maintenance was an act of gritty persistence, a ritual of patience and quiet suffering. Your tools are simple, almost primitive. A pair of stiff metal tweezers. A bit of soot or burnt cork. A cloth. And an immense amount of willpower. Victorian tweezers were more tool of punishment than instrument of beauty. Cold, heavy, and often imprecise, they pinched as much skin as hair. Each pluck sent a sharp sting across the brow bone, a reminder that beauty was rarely gentle in this era. But this pain was expected, even required. A well-maintained woman endured it silently, with the same stoic calm she brought to corsets, elaborate hairstyles, and the endless social expectations of the day. Why so much effort? Because Victorian society feared anything bold, especially on a woman's face. A strong brow suggested confidence, defiance, or temperament, qualities that made the era's moral authorities nervous. So the fashionable aim became brows that were soft, faint, and nearly invisible. They should give the face structure without emphasizing it. They should be elegant, but never expressive. The ideal Victorian brow often resembled a whisper of a line, something you could miss entirely if she blinked. They curved gently, subtly, drawn like a shy question mark instead of a confident arch. Your job each morning was to pluck away anything too thick, too wild, too expressive. Any hair that pointed in a direction not approved by the invisible rulebook of polite society had to go. Between each painful pinch, you checked the mirror. Did the brow look symmetrical? Was it faint enough to pass judgment from the ladies at church? Was it thin enough to seem refined, yet not so thin that it looked unnatural? Victorian beauty was obsessed with walking that impossible line between effortless and perfect. Eyebrows were perhaps the clearest example of that tension. But what if, during this cautious plucking, you removed too much? What if your mirror betrayed you? What if your hand slipped on that cold morning when the fireplace had gone out and the room was frigid? That is when the soot came out. Burnt cork or soot from the previous night's fire became the secret tool of many Victorian women. You dipped your pinky finger lightly into the black powder and tapped it along the brow to fill in sparse areas. The goal was not drama, just subtle reinforcement. A shadow of a brow where a shadow should have been. But this, too, was dangerous. If someone caught you applying soot to your face, it could spark whispers for an entire season. Women practiced the art of doing it so quickly, so delicately, that even a servant passing by might not notice. One light tap. One gentle blend. No more. Rain was the enemy. Humidity was a traitor. Even an emotional afternoon spent reading poetry could threaten your brows, as a single teardrop could drag a streak of soot down your cheek. So women held their expression still. They blinked gently. They did not rub their eyes. They avoided leaning too close to warm lamps in case the heat softened the thin layer of powder holding their brows together. The struggle did not end there. Victorians judged eyebrows silently but harshly. A woman walking into a drawing room could feel eyes drift not to her gown, not to her gloves, but slightly above to see whether she had succeeded in achieving that delicate, nearly invisible aesthetic. A brow too thick. She must be careless. A brow too thin. She must be ill. A brow too dark. Suspicious. Improper. Possibly influenced by French beauty standards, which was practically an accusation of scandal. The rules shifted constantly, but one thing remained: your eyebrows could not attract attention. They existed only to frame, never to announce. They were a background detail in the portrait of Victorian femininity. Middle-class women, who often lacked the leisure or money for elaborate routines, sometimes suffered the most from these expectations. Too busy to pluck meticulously, too aware of the judgment they might face if they skipped it, they lived in a state of permanent compromise, trying their best, often in dim lighting, with tools that resisted their intentions. Upper-class women had their ladies' maids to assist, but even this introduced new complications. A maid who knew her mistress's brow secrets wielded power. One mispluck, one too bold stroke of soot, could sabotage a social event. A careless comment in the servants' hall could become gossip that spread across the household in hours. In this era, where women's reputations were fragile and constantly monitored, even eyebrows became political. And then, of course, there was the ever-present threat of weather. London fog was not kind to delicacy. Mist could cling to the face, softening powder until it threatened to run. A sudden gust of wind could shift hair across the brow, smearing the soot beneath. Women learned to walk with astonishing stillness, protecting their brows with instinctive precision. But beneath all the pressure, there was something strangely intimate about these moments. Sitting before the mirror, breathing quietly, shaping those faint lines, it was one of the few daily rituals a Victorian woman performed truly for herself. In a world where so much of her appearance was controlled, dictated, or judged by society, the act of tending her eyebrows in private felt like a tiny claim of autonomy. Each faint line she shaped was hers. Each careful blend of soot was a decision she controlled. And each morning, no matter what happened the day before, she could begin again creating the version of herself she wished to present to the world. Eyebrows may seem small in the grand tapestry of Victorian beauty, but they reveal something deeper: the daily quiet work women performed to survive a system that expected perfection without acknowledging the labor behind it. A system that demanded invisibility while scrutinizing every detail. A system that left little room for self-expression, yet compelled women to engage in these subtle acts of artistry each morning. Victorian brows were not just hair. They were a performance of modesty, a negotiation with expectations, and a symbol of how much effort a woman could pour into simply being acceptable. And beneath it all, beneath the soot, the tweezers, the pain, was a quiet, determined resilience. A reminder that even in an era obsessed with faint beauty, women found ways to shape themselves. If there is one universal truth about Victorian London, it is this: before a woman stepped outside looking graceful, serene, and perfectly composed, she had already survived a battle with her own clothing. A long battle. A sweaty, breathless, nerve-wracking battle where victory was not guaranteed, and defeat was both humiliating and highly likely to become local gossip. The modern idea of getting dressed, slipping into something comfortable and functional, simply did not exist for Victorian women. Instead, the morning began with a kind of quiet dread, the knowledge that before she even thought about dealing with society, she must first face the enemy closest to her, the wardrobe. At the foundation of it all was the chemise, a whisper-thin linen slip that supposedly protected the outer garments from body oils and sweat. In reality, it shifted, bunched, and twisted like a living creature. Every movement caused it to crawl upward or twist at the waist, creating a discomfort that followed a woman throughout the day like a polite but persistent ghost. The chemise did not protect her clothes nearly as well as it irritated her skin, but it was non-negotiable. Then came the drawers, long, split-legged undergarments designed to preserve modesty yet strangely engineered with a gap right where a woman most hoped for coverage. They swished awkwardly as she walked, catching drafts and allowing breezes to flow in places no breeze should ever go. Victorian women learned to walk carefully not just because of etiquette, but because any overly enthusiastic stride turned their undergarments into wind instruments. The real ordeal began with the corset. Not just a garment, a sculpting tool. A discipline device. A symbol of social ranking. And the reason fainting couches were not just decorative furniture. A Victorian woman rarely tightened her own corset. She needed a maid, a sister, or at least someone with strong wrists and questionable sympathy. The laces were pulled until her waist resembled a pleasant idea rather than a physical reality. Breathing became optional, speaking became a delicate art, and bending at the waist became impossible. But the corset was only step 3. Next came the petticoats. The first sign that this dressing ritual might last all day if she were not careful. Petticoats rustled like restless curtains. They grabbed at ankles. They collected dust from the floor. They sometimes collected pets. A single morning glance under a Victorian woman's skirt might reveal lint, stray feathers, and, on an unlucky day, a startled mouse trapped in the voluminous folds. 2 petticoats were typical. 3 showed good breeding. 4 or 5 meant you were attending something important, or trying to survive winter. And then the crinoline. The crinoline was a metal cage disguised as elegance. Steel hoops stacked like a bell, held in place by fabric strips and sheer optimism. Wearing one meant claiming an impressive radius of personal space 3 feet, sometimes more, which was wonderful unless you had to fit through a doorway, sit in a carriage, or participate in any activity that required bending, turning, or being near other humans. A Victorian woman sitting in a crinoline was a spectacle. The cage tilted, shifted, and attempted escape every time she moved. Many found themselves unintentionally catapulted forward while attempting to sit, landing in a heap of skirts, dignity, and creaking metal. The crinoline may have created the fashionable bell shape, but it also provided constant fear of becoming airborne in a strong wind. And yet, she was still not dressed. Over the crinoline went more petticoats, meant to smooth out the silhouette and keep the metal structure from showing through the dress. Then came the underskirt, followed by the overskirt, each layer heavier and more elaborately decorated than the last. Some skirts were so weighty they could have doubled as blankets. Others were stiffened with horsehair to create the right shape, itchy, stubborn, and guaranteed to cause at least one wardrobe malfunction at the worst possible moment. Then came the bodice. A bodice had to be fitted, flawless, and so tight that breathing became an intellectual concept rather than a physical necessity. The sleeves could be small and delicate, or enormous constructions resembling swan wings. Many Victorian women joked privately that their sleeves entered the room before they did. With each hook, each button, each lace pulled taut, she became more of a sculpture and less of a person. But even after the full dress was on, there was more. Gloves, essential to disguise the sinful scandal of bare hands. Stockings, pulled tight and inspected for perfectly straight seams. Boots or slippers, narrow and painfully shaped to produce dainty feet. A shawl, if modesty required. A jacket, if weather threatened. A hat, pinned so securely it could survive a moderate storm. And finally the bonnet, tied so firmly that turning her neck became a luxury. The entire ensemble could weigh up to 15 kilograms. It squeaked. It rustled. It pinched. It overheated. It trapped air. It restricted circulation. It made simple movements, stepping, sitting, turning, tasks requiring planning, strategy, and occasionally divine guidance. Walking in this attire demanded excellent posture and large reserves of patience. Each step risked stepping on a skirt, tangling a petticoat, knocking over a vase, or revealing a forbidden glimpse of ankle. Women learned to glide, not walk, to avoid letting the clothing reveal its rebellious tendencies. Sitting required careful calculations. Knees could not spread. Skirts had to be arranged like gathering storm clouds. And a misjudged seat could lead to the crinoline tipping upward in front, a catastrophe of geometry and shame. Going outdoors added extra danger. Wind turned skirts into sails. Rain turned fabrics into sponges. Mud clung lovingly to every layer. London's notorious fog-soaked cloth and crushed curls. And a single sooty gust could undo hours of early morning hairwork and eyebrow maintenance. Despite all this, Victorian fashion carried deep meaning. Clothing communicated marital status, social class, mood, respectability, and even mourning stage. Every layer had a purpose. Every bow a message, every feather a quiet declaration. But the truth was simpler. Victorian women became experts at enduring discomfort. They transformed daily suffering into elegance. They made personal resilience look like effortless grace. And at the end of the day, breathless, sore, overheated, and exhausted, they peeled each layer off one by one, feeling a freedom so sweet it bordered on spiritual. For a few nighttime hours, their bodies belonged to them again. Until morning, when the entire battle would begin all over again. If you truly want to understand the unspoken strength of Victorian women, do not look at their corsets, or their hairpins, or their endless layers of petticoats. Look at their shoes, small, elegant, impossibly narrow things that seem almost decorative rather than functional. Victorian shoes were not built for walking. They were built for signaling refinement. Every pair told the world, I move carefully. I move beautifully. And I move through pain without complaint. Imagine standing by your bedside in stockings, staring down at the delicate pair of shoes waiting for you. They look charming, soft leather, neat stitching, tiny buttons or ribbons. But appearances deceive. Victorian shoes were crafted for shape, not comfort. The ideal foot of the time was small, narrow, and dainty, a foot that seemed to float rather than strike the ground. Shoes reflected that ideal so rigidly that many women spent their entire lives trying to shrink themselves to fit the fashion. The shoes were usually made of thin leather or fabric so stiff it barely flexed. The soles were flat but unpadded, offering no protection from cobblestones, uneven dirt paths, or the rough wooden floors of many homes. Heels were small but firm, not meant to support but to elevate, ever so slightly, the perceived grace of the wearer. And the shape. A pointed toe box so narrow it felt like squeezing the foot into a polite but unforgiving trap. Putting them on required patience. You slipped your foot inside the narrow opening, wiggling your toes into a space that seemed to shrink each time you tried. Your heel resisted, sliding against the hard back edge. A maid might help, guiding the foot gently while holding the shoe steady. Then came the button's small mother of pearl circles arranged neatly along the side of the shoe. They had to be fastened using a button hook, a tiny metal tool used to pull each button through its narrow slit. Without it, dressing could take an eternity. With the final button clasped, the discomfort began immediately. Your toes pressed together. The arch received no support. The heel slipped slightly, but only enough to cause friction that would later turn into blisters. And yet, these were your indoor shoes, the shoes worn for breakfast, for reading in the parlor, for tea with visiting family. The least painful ones. Outdoor shoes were their own ordeal. Walking outdoors in Victorian London meant walking through uneven stones, mud, slush, soot, and debris. Yet the shoes were barely thicker than slippers. Some had thin leather soles. Others had wooden or metal-tipped heels that sounded elegant but offered little stability. A sudden shift in weight could twist an ankle. A misplaced step on cobblestone could send a shock of pain up the leg. And still, women walked slowly, gracefully, each step a battle between dignity and discomfort. Victorian etiquette guides instructed women to glide rather than stride, a movement that kept pain invisible and silhouette smooth. A proper walk should make no sound except the gentle tap of the heel. No heavy steps. No urgent pace. Even the way they carried pain had to be elegant. But shoes were not just footwear, they were social markers. A small foot was considered beautiful. Slender ankles were admired. To confess to having large or wide feet was to confess to lacking grace. And to request shoes in a larger size carried a quiet shame. Many women simply squeezed themselves into smaller pairs, believing it better to endure daily pain than appear unfashionable. The consequences showed over time. calluses shaped like small moons, bruised toenails, blisters that never fully healed, toes pressed together so long they began to overlap. Some women developed permanent changes in gait, walking lightly on the edges of their feet to avoid pressure. But Victorian culture rewarded endurance. A woman who suffered silently was admired. Comfort was secondary. Appearance was everything. Shoemakers did not design with anatomy in mind. They designed with aesthetics. And aesthetics dictated that women's shoes must make the foot appear miniature, even if it meant hours of discomfort. The phrase dainty feet was more important than comfortable feet. A woman who walked too quickly risked seeming unladylike. A woman who limped was pitted gently, never told outright that her shoes were the culprit. Inside grand houses, floors were smooth and polished, making walking easier. But in the streets, reality revealed itself. Mud seeped into seams. Rain soaked thin leather instantly. Cold made the fabric stiffen, biting the skin beneath. In winter, some women wrapped heated bricks in cloth to warm their feet before leaving home, knowing full well the warmth would vanish minutes into their walk. Then there was the matter of dancing. Victorian balls were glittering events, full of music, candlelight, and swirling skirts. But for women, they were also foot marathons in shoes designed for appearance, not activity. Dancing shoes were even thinner than regular ones, delicate slippers with flimsy soles. They allowed women to glide effortlessly across polished floors, but offered zero protection. By the end of a waltz-heavy evening, feet burned, blisters formed, ankles ached, and shoes were barely holding together. Yet the next morning, those same women were expected to appear serene and composed, as though nothing had happened. No limping. No complaints. No visible signs of the pain that had followed them home last night. But perhaps the most revealing aspect of Victorian footwear was how it shaped movement. Shoes determined how women walked: small steps, tight strides, minimal weight on the heel. They contributed to the famed Victorian posture, that delicate upright silhouette that many describe as angelic. But behind that airy elegance lived constant discomfort. Each step was calculated. Each shift of weight was measured. Shoes forced women to inhabit their own bodies carefully, always aware of pressure, balance, and pain. Many women also struggled with swollen feet due to corsets restricting circulation. The tighter the corset, the more likely the feet swelled. And swollen feet inside narrow shoes created a unique agony one women simply lived with because fashion demanded it. Even removing the shoes at night could be painful. Undoing the buttons took time. Sliding the foot out required effort. And the relief that followed was immediate and enormous. Blood returned. Toes spread. Ankles relaxed. It was one of the few moments in a Victorian day when a woman could fully exhale a private, intimate liberation. But even then, the shoes sat by the bedside, waiting silently for the next morning. Victorian shoes were not just objects. They were symbols. Of endurance. Of elegance. Of sacrifice. Of the quiet strength of women who carried the world's expectations on footwear that barely supported them. Behind every graceful step was a story of resilience. Behind every dainty shoe was a woman learning to move through discomfort with dignity. And behind every bow, every button, every polished heel, lived a truth Victorian society rarely acknowledged. Beauty demanded pain and women bore it bravely, silently, endlessly. If corsets squeezed the body and crinolines shaped the silhouette, then Victorian etiquette ruled the soul. Social life in the 19th century was not simply a matter of gathering with friends or exchanging pleasant conversation. It was a complex system, a quiet battlefield populated with rules, glances, expectations, and subtle traps. A Victorian woman lived not just in her home, or her dress, or her city. She lived inside a web of reputation. Even something as simple as stepping out the front door required strategy. Before she confronted the weather or the street, she had to confront society's gaze, a gaze that weighed, measured, and interpreted every detail: her clothes, her posture, her accessories, her expression, the timing of her outings, even the speed of her steps. The day's social choreography began early. Once dressed and prepared, she descended the stairs already aware that any servant, sibling, or visiting acquaintance might form an opinion based solely on her morning expression. A smile too bright seemed frivolous. A somber face suggested emotional unrest. Calm, measured neutrality was the ideal. Breakfast itself often held social rules: which topics could be spoken of, who took their seat first, who poured the tea, who asked polite morning questions, and who waited. Everything had a sequence. Everything had meaning. But the real performance began with the system of calling cards. Calling cards were small rectangles of carefully printed paper carrying a woman's name, elegant, formal, almost ceremonial. They were the keys to social life. To leave a card at someone's home was to express respect, interest, or obligation. Receiving a card required proper reciprocation. Failing to reciprocate created a subtle fracture, a sign that the relationship was unbalanced, or worse, undesirable. Every woman had a small case for her cards, carried like a weapon of etiquette. She stepped into a carriage or onto the street knowing her route might include visiting households in sequence, leaving cards at doors, and receiving cards in return. Some visits were ritualistic, not meant for conversation at all, only for the symbolic act of leaving her presence. Others required brief exchanges in parlors filled with afternoon light, where every gesture signaled propriety. Entering a parlor was its own delicate art. A Victorian woman walked with small, careful steps, not only to maintain elegance but to avoid disturbing the elaborate layers of skirts that trailed behind her. When she reached her seat, she did not simply sit. She arranged herself. She lowered her body slowly so her crinoline behaved politely. She smoothed her dress with fingertips. She positioned her hands in her lap with a gentleness that suggested modesty, not idleness. Conversation followed rules, too. Women spoke softly, never loudly, and never with sharp laughter or sudden exclamations. Topics were curated, agreeable, mild, tidy. Weather, seasonal changes, art, books deemed appropriate, local events that carried no controversy, babies, if the mother wished to discuss them. Never illness. Never household drama. Never finances. Never relationships. These belonged to private life and were tightly guarded. But beneath the polite words, an entire world existed, a world of unspoken messages. A longer than expected pause after a compliment could imply disbelief. A small smile could suggest approval or conceal judgment. A refusal to meet someone's eyes might quietly announce disapproval. A shift in posture could indicate discomfort, boredom, or calculation. Victorian socializing was a silent language, spoken through glances, tone, and timing. Women mastered it because they had to. Their reputation depended on it. And reputation was everything. A single misstep, a poorly chosen comment, a visible frustration, a rumor whispered by a jealous acquaintance could follow a woman for years. Sometimes for life. Victorian society did not forget easily, and it forgave even less. This pressure shaped daily routines around emotional restraint. If a Victorian woman felt tired, she could not show it. If she felt overwhelmed, she masked it behind a serene expression. If she disagreed with someone, she softened her tone until her objection sounded like a passing breeze. The more she struggled internally, the calmer she had to appear externally. The contrast between inner life and outer performance created a constant tension, one that Victorian literature captured often. Women existed in two parallel realities, their emotional world and the world they displayed to others. Beyond drawing rooms, there were events, highly structured gatherings like teas, luncheons, garden parties, musicales, and full evening balls. Each came with its own wardrobe requirements. A tea dress differed from a visiting dress. A luncheon dress needed modest embellishment. An evening gown required silk or satin, with gloves, fan, and jewelry whispering refinement. At events, movement itself became a form of etiquette. Women held fans in prescribed ways, closed for calm, fluttered for interest, raised for mild embarrassment. Chairs were occupied only with permission. Dance partners were accepted or declined through a delicate balance that avoided offense. Conversations were brief, almost like performances within a larger performance. And then there were the dangers. Victorian social circles were fertile grounds for gossip, the era's most destructive weapon. Gossip flowed gently, quietly, like a river under thin ice. One careless remark could become an entire narrative. A missed visit could be interpreted as disrespect. An appearance that seemed too showy could be read as vanity. An appearance too modest could be seen as poor taste or emotional instability. Women learned to guard themselves not just from actions, but from interpretations. Even something as simple as walking in the park required attention. Who saw her? Who she greeted? Whether she appeared cheerful? Whether she paused too long to admire scenery? Whether her bonnet ribbons matched her gloves? Her entire existence was an ongoing assessment in the eyes of society. And yet, despite the constraints, Victorian social life held moments of genuine warmth. Women formed strong friendships, sharing whispered confessions in quiet corners. They exchanged letters filled with poetry and secrets. They found allies in those who understood the pressure. They supported each other through heartbreak, illness, and disappointment. And within the rigid rules, they found small escapes, a stolen laugh, a shared glance. A gentle moment of real human connection. These moments mattered because they were rare and precious. When evening fell and a woman returned home after a day of navigating this complex world, she often felt emotionally exhausted. Her feet ached from narrow shoes. Her back tensed from holding impeccable posture. Her face ached slightly from maintaining polite expressions. And her mind buzzed with the weight of conversations, impressions, and hidden meanings. Only in the privacy of her room, with her corset loosened, hairpins removed, shoes off, and social mask lowered, could she breathe fully again. Victorian social life expected perfection. And yet women survived it not through compliance alone, but through resilience. Through subtle rebellions. Through friendships. Through quiet inner strength that no etiquette book could ever capture. Behind every graceful appearance lived a woman navigating a complex social labyrinth with elegance, endurance, and a quiet courage the world often overlooked. If Victorian fashion made movement a careful performance, then Victorian dining turned the simple act of eating into a quiet ritual of restraint. Nothing in this era was ordinary, not walking, not sitting, not socializing. And food, perhaps the most essential human need, became yet another test of elegance, composure, and discipline. Imagine stepping into a Victorian dining room. Heavy drapes soften the light. The table glows with silverware polished to a mirror sheen. Every chair seems positioned at the perfect angle. Everything feels almost ceremonial. And at the center of it all sits a woman calm, composed, and already fully aware that her every gesture will be quietly observed. She may be hungry. She may have eaten very little earlier in the day because her corset left almost no room for breath, let alone appetite. But when the first dish arrives, she does not lean forward with anticipation. She does not take the largest portion. She does not even show the slightest hint of eagerness. Because for Victorian women, appetite was dangerous socially, symbolically, and visually. A woman who appeared hungry risked being seen as unbecoming. A woman who ate quickly risked being seen as undisciplined. A woman who enjoyed food too openly risked being seen as indulgent. Victorians prized delicacy, both in body and spirit. A refined woman ate lightly, slowly, silently, and with a kind of polite detachment, almost as though food was a pleasant afterthought rather than a necessity. The reality, of course, was different. Beneath the tightly laced corset, her stomach had only a fraction of its natural space. Every bite of food pushed against the rigid structure surrounding her ribs. Each swallow created a slight pressure. A full plate was more intimidating than inviting. But she smiled softly. She made small talk. She cut her food into tiny pieces. She placed each bite delicately on her tongue, never opening her mouth more than needed. She chewed minimally, quietly, and swallowed gracefully. Eating became an act of choreography. Her knife angled at the correct degree. Her fork held with gentle precision. Her wrist relaxed but never limp. Her elbows kept close to her sides. Her gaze downward. Respectful, never hovering too long over the plate. Victorian etiquette manuals dedicated entire sections to dining warnings about how not to hold utensils, how not to cut bread, how not to drink too quickly. Some rules seem excessive to modern eyes: never tilt your soup bowl, never blow on hot soup, never finish a plate completely lest you appear overeager, never refuse food without a gentle excuse. Never show visible delight when tasting something you enjoy. Why so many rules? Because the dining table was a public stage disguised as a domestic space. Especially for unmarried women, meals were opportunities for judgment by future in-laws, by family friends, by visiting acquaintances who would later report their impressions. A woman's behavior at the table was believed to reveal her upbringing, her character, and even her moral strength. A woman who maintained delicate restraint, admirable. A woman who showed hearty appetite, questionable. A woman who faltered, lost composure, or appeared uncomfortable, unfitting for polite society. But beneath the surface of this rigid politeness lay the physical struggle no etiquette book dared mention. Let us imagine the experience from her perspective. Her corset presses firmly against her ribcage. Her abdomen feels tightly packed, leaving little room for food. The weight of her layered skirts pulls at her hips, the bodice presses into her torso, and the heat of the dining room thick with the warmth of candles and conversation creates a subtle dizziness. She lifts her fork, trying to maintain calm, but each swallow feels like a negotiation between her body and her clothing. Yet she continues. Not because she is not struggling, but because Victorian society trained women to hide all discomfort. If the food is warm and savory, she must not show too much enjoyment. If it is bland or unpleasant, she must not show disappointment. Her job is to exist in a constant state of pleasant neutrality. And it does not end at the table. After meals, it was common for women to withdraw into drawing rooms while men remained behind for brandy or cigars. Women drank tea light. Floral tea which eased digestion only slightly. In these drawing rooms, more conversation followed. A woman could not lean back too deeply into her chair. She could not rub her stomach. She could not sigh with relief. She simply maintained posture, her spine straight and her shoulders relaxed, even as the corset reminded her of the limits of her body. Sometimes, private letters from the era reveal the truth: Victorian women could not speak in public. I longed for air. But I smiled instead. My dress would not permit a full breath. I nibbled at my food until the meal passed. I envied the men who ate freely. It was not just about appetite, it was about being watched. A single moment of misbehavior, a crumb falling, a sip taken too quickly, a cough, a moment of indigestion could become a family anecdote told for years. Victorian social life remembered small mistakes with surprising longevity. Yet, there were softer moments too. Friends laughed quietly together when no one was listening. Sisters passed small morsels they loved to each other when parents looked away. Mothers gently guided daughters' hands, teaching them how to hold a fork in the way that the world expected. Housemaids slipped extra fruit or bread to young women who struggled with the limited portions. Behind all the pressure, there were small acts of kindness. Food also carried emotional meaning. A warm loaf of bread meant comfort in winter. A bowl of fresh berries meant a moment of sweetness in a strict world. A cup of tea meant gentleness after a long day. And late at night, when the household slept, when candles burned low, when the corset finally hung loose beside the bed, a Victorian woman might allow herself a quiet bite of something she loved. No performance. No pressure. No eyes watching. Just the simple joy of eating freely. Victorian dining etiquette was not cruel on purpose. It simply reflected a society obsessed with symbolism, where every gesture communicated something, and where women's behavior was viewed as the core of family respectability. But behind the elegance lived a truth: Victorian women endured a constant negotiation between hunger, discomfort, and the need to appear effortless. Their grace at the table was not born of privilege, it was built from discipline, patience, and the quiet strength of performing calmness while their bodies longed for relief. And when they finally retired to their rooms at night, they carried with them not just the memory of the meal, but the weight of every expectation they had skillfully navigated. When evening finally arrived in Victorian London, it did not feel like a moment of pure rest. It felt like the slow unwinding of a performance that had lasted since dawn, a performance stitched together with etiquette, restraint, and the quiet endurance that Victorian society expected from its women. Night was the only time a woman could truly breathe. Imagine stepping into your dimly lit bedroom after a long day in heavy clothing, narrow shoes, and polite smiles. The lamps glow softly, throwing warm shadows across the floor. The house is finally quiet, no conversations to maintain, no visitors to impress, no judgments hovering in the background. Just a moment that belongs entirely to you. The first relief comes with the loosening of the corset. Your maid helps you unfasten the back laces, pulling them slowly, steadily, until the fabric relaxes. As the pressure lifts from your ribs and waist, your lungs expand fully for the first time all day. You inhale deeply, feeling air move down into places it has not reached since morning. Victorian women often described this moment in diaries with almost poetic tenderness. I felt my breath return to me. A softness filled my chest. I could finally stand without stiffness. The corset slips away from your body, warm on the inside, stiff on the outside. For a brief moment, you simply stand there, not straight-backed and rigid, but natural, human, comfortable in your own skin. Then begins the long undoing. You remove the layers one by one. The bodice. The skirts. The petticoats. The crinoline cage. The chemise. Each layer lifted frees a different part of your body. Your shoulders relax. Your hips feel lighter. Your legs can finally step without fabric clinging or pushing. You are, bit by bit, returning to yourself. Victorian dresses were beautiful, yes, but they also trapped warmth, collected sweat, and held the day's exhaustion in their stitches. Removing them was like lifting away the weight of the whole world. Next comes the hair. After holding up curls, braids, twists, and pins all day, your scalp hums with a dull ache. Sitting before the mirror, you begin removing pins, dozens of them, sometimes more. Each one makes a soft clink as it joins a little pile on the vanity. With every pin removed, your head feels lighter, your mood softer. Your hair falls slowly, like silk unrolling. The curls are lopsided and slightly wilted from weather and time. Some strands still smell faintly of the oils you used in the morning. Victorian hair, bound so tightly during the day, becomes wild and free at night. Women brushed their hair carefully, long, slow strokes meant to soothe both strands and spirit. The brush passing repeatedly through the hair had a calming rhythm, almost meditative. It helped release tension built up in the scalp and neck. It also prepared the strands to rest overnight, so they would not form too many knots by morning. After brushing, some women applied soft creams or oils, rosemary, almond, lavender, believing they encouraged shine and strength. Others braided their hair loosely to prevent tangles. A hairnet or soft cloth wrap completed the ritual, keeping everything in place until sunrise. Then there was the skin. Victorian beauty standards demanded the impossible during the day: perfectly pale skin, no shine, no redness, no visible struggle. At night, the face could finally be honest. Women removed powder with cold cream, wiping away the matte perfection society insisted upon. The cream, cool and thick, soothed irritated skin worn down by hours of smiling, suppressing emotion, and enduring environmental grime. Cold cream had a comforting scent, light, floral, clean. Its softness offered a small kindness to skin that had spent the day under scrutiny. A woman might massage her temples gently, easing the day's quiet headaches. She might apply rosewater to calm the cheeks. A little balm on the lips helped restore softness. These moments were not vanity but healing, a gentle tending of oneself after a day spent tending to everyone else's expectations. Yet even nighttime offered its own tasks. A Victorian woman wrote letters before bed, thoughtful, measured correspondences that were part of maintaining social ties. She might read a few pages of a moral book, as was encouraged, or whisper a prayer in the stillness of her room. She might reflect on the day's encounters, analyzing each word she had spoken, ensuring nothing she said could be misinterpreted or gossiped about. Because tomorrow would bring new expectations. New people to greet. New appearances to maintain. New judgments to avoid. New silences to survive. Before slipping under the covers, she checked the fire in the grate. She arranged her nightdress carefully, ensuring it was modest and proper even though no one would see her. She climbed into bed slowly because even lying down required adjusting the bedding around her. Victorian beds were tall, often with heavy blankets and mattresses that smelled faintly of lavender, starch, and thyme. Once settled, she exhaled deeply. The day's performance dissolved. No one could see her now. No one expected anything of her. No one was measuring her appearance or her posture. She was simply herself, tired, thoughtful, quietly resilient. But even in sleep, the next day hovered like a shadow. She would wake early. She would brush her hair. She would inspect her skin. She would tighten her corset. She would assemble her layers. She would polish her shoes. She would rehearse her expressions. She would enter the world once again as the version of herself society demanded. And yet the nighttime softness mattered. It was the only time she could let her body rest freely. The only time she was not constrained by layers, rules, or other people's perceptions. The only time she could truly feel her breath fill her lungs without restriction. The only time she was not performing. These quiet hours gave her the strength to wake again the next morning and repeat everything required. Night was not just the end of a Victorian woman's day. Night was her sanctuary. Her exhale. Her return to humanity. A place where she could unravel, restore, and remind herself silently, tenderly that beneath all the fabric and powder and posture, she was still a person with her own thoughts, her own dreams, her own exhaustion, and her own quiet resilience. And when the lamps finally dimmed and the sounds of the street faded into silence, she let herself drift into sleep. Knowing that tomorrow, the whole beautifully exhausting cycle would begin again. And so, as we slowly step back from the soft lamplight of Victorian London, one thing becomes beautifully clear: the women of this era lived lives layered with quiet strength. They navigated discomfort with elegance, endured pressure with grace, and carried expectations so heavy they were rarely spoken aloud. Every morning, they built themselves piece by piece corsets, curls, powder, etiquette, silence, and every night they gently unbuilt themselves again, returning to the softness of who they truly were. Behind every perfect curl was discipline. Behind every pale cheek was restraint. Behind every polite smile was a private world we rarely acknowledge. They were not fragile, they were resilient in ways history often overlooks. And as we have walked with them through early mornings, long afternoons, and quiet midnight rituals, we have glimpsed the human moments beneath their polished exterior, the quiet sighs, the small rebellions, the longing for comfort, the tenderness they gave themselves when the world finally stopped watching. Thank you for wandering through this slow, gentle journey with me tonight, a journey through fabrics, footsteps, whispers, and the invisible weight of Victorian expectations. If this story helped you relax, unwind, or simply see the past with softer eyes, I am truly glad. Until next time, sleep well, stay curious, and let the old worlds keep you company. Good night, everyone. Sparkles.